The sun rose cold and golden over Eastern Europe when, at 3:15 a.m., June 22nd, 1941, hell had been unleashed. Without warning, the deafening roar of thousands of cannons and tank engines, it tore through the silence of the border. Operation Barbarossa, it was underway. More than 3 million German soldiers, accompanied by 600,000 vehicles, 600,000 horses, and 4,000 airplanes, they invaded the territory of the Soviet Union. It was the largest ground attack in human history, an avalanche of steel, fire, and arrogance. The Germans marched with almost godlike confidence. They sang patriotic songs, believing that in a few weeks they would be parading through the streets of Moscow. Hitler watched everything from his headquarters, with a glint of triumph in his eyes. He believed he was facing the final piece of his great dream, the habitat, the living space that would transform Germany into a boundless empire. To him, Russia was nothing more than a rotten giant, sustained by fear and lies. The Red Army, a colossus with feet of clay, he said, an enemy that would crumble as soon as it was pushed, and at first it seemed like he was right. The German formations, the legendary ones, panzer divisions, advanced like a living wave. The planes of Air Force, they swept across the sky, destroying hundreds of Soviet planes still on the ground. The border towns, from Brest to Grodno, were swallowed up in hours. The stunned peasants watched the horizon burn as columns of German tanks and trucks sped past, kicking up clouds of dust and smoke. But there was something Hitler didn't see, something no map could show. Beneath that fertile, cold ground slept a monster, the spirit of Russian resistance. A people accustomed to enduring hunger, cold, and endless wars. A people who would not flee, even if the sky were to fall. The mud from the roads began to swallow the tires and the footsteps. The bodies of the fallen soldiers began to mix with the earth. And little by little, that colossus with feet of clay that Hitler despised began to harden, transforming into a wall of steel and blood. Hitler's dream was only just beginning, but what he didn't know was that by opening the gates of the East, he had also opened the gates of hell. If this story hooked you, the next ones will hit even harder. Subscribe now. The first days of the invasion were a spectacle of speed and destruction as panzer divisions, those steel beasts commanded by generals like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, they advanced with almost mechanical precision. The Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was showing its full force. The tanks crisscrossed the wheat fields and muddy roads, swallowing everything in their path. The planes dove from the sky in deadly dives, dropping bombs that made the ground tremble. Soviet communications were being cut off one by one, and the Air Force, it destroyed trains and columns of fleeing soldiers. It seemed that nothing, absolutely nothing, could stop the German war machine. The cities were collapsing like dominoes. Minsk, the first major capital, was besieged in just 6 days. More than 100,000 Soviet soldiers, they were killed or taken prisoner, a devastating blow for Stalin. German radio broadcast daily victories, while Nazi propaganda shouted from the rooftops, "The Red Army has been annihilated. Moscow will be ours in a few weeks." But behind that triumphant facade, the reality was grotesque. The roads were covered in burnt. Tank carcasses, dead horses, torn soldiers, and terrified civilians trying to escape. The smell of war, gunpowder, oil, and burnt flesh permeated the air like a warning. The villagers watched their homes burn down, their family members shot dead on mere suspicion of resistance. The German advance brought not only destruction, it also hatred, anger, and the blind belief in victory. The German generals were euphoric. Guderian believed that in a matter of days he would cross the Dnieper and would open a direct route to Moscow. But the further they advanced, the longer the supply lines became, and the harder it was to feed both men and machines. The trucks got stuck, the horses died, and fuel began to run out. The Russian summer sun burned on helmets and breastplates, turning the inside of the tanks into a furnace. Many soldiers were beginning to delirious with exhaustion, marching through clouds of flies and dust. Even so, the order was clear: to move forward, always forward. No rest, no retreat, just the road to the east, where the next big city awaited: Smolensk. There, on the gates of Moscow, the lightning of the Blitzkrieg would confront something that neither Hitler nor his generals were prepared to face. The fury of an empire that refused to die. July 1941. The Russian plains scorched under the sun. The dust from the roads formed a thick fog, and the air smelled of iron, sweat, and death. The German advance seemed unstoppable, but ahead of them, on the horizon, rose a name that would begin to change everything: Smolensk. Smolensk was not just a city, it was a gateway to Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Empire. For centuries, that point had been the strategic key to the route to the center of Russia. Napoleon had passed through there in 1812, and what awaited him afterward was a frozen and deadly hell. But Hitler ignored history. He believed his fate would be different. The German generals, intoxicated by their victories at Minsk and Białystok, believed that Smolensk would fall within a few days. The tanks of Guderian coming from the south and those from Hoth coming from the north, they advanced like two sharp claws, ready to close in on the city. The radios transmitted curt orders: objective, Smolensk. Destroy all enemy forces en route. But the Red Army was no longer fleeing. After the devastating defeats of the previous weeks, the Soviets began to understand the war they were facing. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, a hardened veteran, he was given the mission to defend Smolensk at any cost, and the price would be paid in blood. The city was bustling. Thousands of civilians dug trenches, fortified streets with stone blocks and barbed wire. Women carried ammunition, children helped erect barricades. Trains packed with reinforcements, T-34 tanks fresh from the factories, and heavy artillery arrived non-stop. The Soviets knew if Smolensk fell, Moscow would be next. On the banks of the Dnieper River, the Soviet divisions took up positions. The soldiers, covered in mud and mosquitoes, waited silently for the distant roar of the German engines. Each man knew he was facing a fight with no turning back. Those who survived that battle would recount that the air seemed to vibrate, as if the earth itself knew what was coming. And then, on a sweltering morning, the thunder began. Hundreds of German tanks appeared on the horizon, advancing like a living wall. The ground trembled, hearts raced. Smolensk would be the stage for a fight unlike any other before, a battle that would mark the end of the dream of Blitzkrieg and the beginning of a nightmare of resistance and destruction. In the village of Smolensk, a Blitzkrieg would begin to bleed. The metallic thunder of the tanks echoed day and night. The German troops advanced, crushing everything in their path: villages, forests, columns of Soviet soldiers. But while Hitler celebrated yet another brilliant advance, something unexpected was brewing in the shadows of the front. Timoshenko's counteroffensive. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, a stern man with a harsh face and a gruff voice, stared at the map spread out on the wooden table. The cigarette smoke rose slowly as he traced lines with his finger, measuring distances, assessing each enemy movement. The reports were devastating. Smolensk was surrounded, dozens of Soviet divisions trapped, but he didn't see defeat. I took a chance. If the enemy thinks he has crushed us, then it's time to bite him back. While the Germans consolidated the siege, Timoshenko began to gather forces from thin air, remnants of destroyed divisions, inexperienced recruits, civilian militias, and even prisoners freed from their cells. Reinforcement trains crossed the bombed roads, and the wounded were pushed off the trains to make room for new fighters. It was an army hastily assembled, poorly armed, poorly fed, but with enough hatred to move mountains. On the front lines, the Soviets were digging trenches with their bare hands. The T-34 and KV-1 tanks, still rare at the time, were positioned in the forests and among ruins, ambushing German columns. The gunners, hidden in barns, awaited the right moment to fire, and when the first shot rang out, the whole earth seemed to respond. The counterattacks came in swarms. Soviet groups attacked from unexpected flanks at night, amidst the fog and smoke from the fires. German tanks, once invincible, were being set ablaze by improvised grenades and Molotov cocktails. Soviet soldiers threw themselves against the war machines, sometimes with dynamite strapped to their bodies, shouting, "For the family, for the fatherland." The Wehrmacht, accustomed to easy victories, now faced something different, an enemy that he did not back down, even in death. The Germans advanced through a village, only to be attacked minutes later by survivors who feigned death. The forests seemed alive, spitting fire and lead. Every tree could hide a rifle, every shadow could be a trap. German radio stations began broadcasting urgent messages. Heavy resistance. The enemy infiltrated our lines. We request reinforcements. Timoshenko, from headquarters, knew he couldn't win on paper, but their goal was not to destroy the Germans. It was delay them, bleed them, and save time to Moscow. Each day that the Battle of Smolensk lasted was a victory. Every German tank burned in the field was one less step towards the capital. And so it was that, beneath the smoke and roar of artillery, the new soul of the Red Army was born, no longer a colossus with feet of clay, but a giant of flesh, mud, and fury. The battlefield has turned into a slaughterhouse. The blood mixed with the mud, and the constant sound of the cannons heralded a truth that Hitler refused to hear. Russia wasn't going to fall, it was waking up. The ground trembled as if hell itself were rising to the surface. It was July 1941, and the plains around Smolensk were turning into a field of smoldering metal. Guderians, tanks, the feared panzer divisions, advanced with the confidence of those who believed themselves invincible. But this time, the enemy did not flee. This time, the Red Army stayed and fought. The columns of German tanks advanced in close formation, raising clouds of dust, the sun reflecting off the black crosses painted on the turrets. The air was thick, vibrant, punctuated by the sound of diesel engines and the distant roar of Soviet artillery. Ahead, a haze of smoke blanketed the fields, and then from the middle of it all they emerged, enormous, almost silent, with their wide turrets and sloped armor. The T-34s and KV-1s, the new Soviet tanks. The Germans were stunned. Their projectiles ricocheted off the T-34's armor like stones thrown at a bell. The metallic sound echoed across the fields, clang, clang, followed by absolute terror as the impassive Soviet tanks continued advancing. They trampled barricades, crushed soldiers, and cut their way through German lines like iron. Monsters. The Panzer III and IV tanks, which had previously dominated the front lines, seemed like toys compared to these machines. The desperate German crews began targeting the caterpillars, trying to immobilize them. But even when stationary, the T-34s continued firing. Soviet 76mm cannons spewed fire, tearing through the air with explosions that hurled debris and bodies into the air. The field turned into a sea of fire. Tanks on fire, ammunition exploding, fuel boiling, soldiers fleeing. Through columns of black smoke, covered in soot and blood. The smell of burnt metal and charred flesh was suffocating. Many, out of ammunition, resorted to desperation, throwing grenades under enemy tanks, even knowing they would die along with them. A German soldier would later write, "We didn't know what those monsters were. We shot and nothing happened. They came unstoppable, as if the devil himself were guiding them." Even so, the Germans continued fighting. The 37mm anti-tank guns, nicknamed picture frames, were useless. But the crews did not retreat. Some, driven mad, would crawl up to the T-34s to place handheld mines under their tracks. The price was life. For every Soviet tank destroyed, 10 men died trying. The sky was on fire too. The Luftwaffe dove in, dropping bombs on the Soviet columns, trying to break the momentum of the counterattacks. The sound of the engines was swallowed up by the roar of the field, explosions, gunshots, screams. It was impossible to tell who was winning. At the end of the day, the ground around Smolensk was a living furnace. Melted tanks, craters, smoke rising to the horizon. Both sides had suffered brutal losses, hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands dead. But one thing was clear: the myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Wehrmacht generals realized, for the first time, that this war would not be quick. And Hitler, in his headquarters, was beginning to hear the first echoes of something he never wanted to believe. The Blitzkrieg was slowing down, and the inferno of Smolensk had just swallowed it whole. Smolensk, July 1941. The name that once evoked images of an ancient Russian city, founded centuries ago as a trading post on the banks of the Dnieper River, was now transforming into a symbol of apocalypse and despair. Strategically situated, surrounded by three rivers, the Dnieper to the south, the Casplia to the east, and the Vopers to the north, and protected by rolling hills that formed a natural barrier, Smolensk had been a vital transit point throughout history. From the time of the Vikings, who navigated the rivers in search of routes to the Black Sea, through the Mongol invasions of the 13th century that left it in ruins, to the Napoleonic Wars of 1812, when French troops set it ablaze on their march to Moscow, the city had always risen from the ashes. But in 1941, under the scorching July sun, it was facing an unprecedented inferno, a cataclysm that would make the flames of yesteryear seem like mere bonfires. The invasion began at dawn on July 10th, when the forces of the German army, part of the immense Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, launched their offensive like a hurricane of steel and fire. More than 900,000 German soldiers, supported by Romanian and Hungarian divisions, advanced with terrifying speed, driven by the Blitzkrieg doctrine that had already conquered Poland, France, and the Baltics in lightning campaigns. The Panzers, tanks like the Panzer III and IV, their tracks screeching on the dry, dusty ground, crossed the plains of western Belarus, leaving behind raised villages and trampled wheat fields. The 2nd Panzer Group, under General Heinz Guderian, and the 3rd Panzer Group, led by Hermann Hoth, formed the pincers of a colossal encirclement movement, aiming to trap the Soviet forces in a deadly scheme. On the Soviet side, the Western Front, commanded by Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, desperately attempted to organize a defense. More than 1 million Red Army soldiers, including the 16th, 19th, and 20th Armies, were hastily mobilized. Many were inexperienced recruits, drafted from collective farms and factories, equipped with rusty Mosin Nagant rifles and ill-fitting uniforms. Fortifications were improvised, trenches dug by hand with shovels and pickaxes, barricades made of felled tree trunks and sandbags filled with damp river soil. Soviet commanders, still traumatized by the Stalinist purges of the 1930s that decimated the high command, ordered suicidal counterattacks to avoid accusations of cowardice. Orders came directly from Moscow, where Stalin, initially incredulous at the invasion, now demanded that not an inch of land be ceded without a fight. The aerial hell began in the first few days. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, dominated the skies with squadrons of Junkers, Ju-87 Stukas, and Heinkel He-111s, aircraft that dove at steep angles, emitting a terrifying howl from their sirens. To break enemy morale, wave after wave, they flew over the narrow streets of Smolensk, dropping incendiary and high-explosive bombs. Each attack lasted for hours. The German pilots, wearing grey uniforms and leather helmets, targeted bridges, train stations, and ammunition depots. The explosions echoed like endless thunder, shaking the ground like earthquakes, causing the ancient city walls, remnants of the 16th century, to collapse in clouds of dust. Wooden windows shattered into shards that cut through flesh like blades, and the thatched and wooden roofs of peasant houses instantly burst into flames, spreading fire that licked the brick walls of Orthodox churches. Black smoke rose in gigantic columns, so dense that it blocked the midday sun, turning the day into an eternal twilight. The air became unbreathable, laden with soot, ash, and the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. Soviet soldiers, their faces blackened and eyes red with irritation, wrapped damp rags, often soaked with urine, or muddy river water, around their mouths and noses to filter the toxic air. Some coughed uncontrollably, spitting out black mucus, while others succumbed to asphyxiation in the stuffy holds. The rivers, once sources of life with clear waters reflecting the cathedral towers, now ran red and viscous, polluted with blood, oil from leaking tanks, and floating debris from bloated bodies. The Red Army transformed Smolensk into an improvised fortress, a network of urban defenses that exploited every inch of the terrain. The medieval streets, with their tight curves and labyrinthine alleys, became deadly traps for the invaders. Small groups of Soviet soldiers, platoons of 10 to 20 men, armed with Degyaryov machine guns and anti-tank grenades, moved like ghosts among the rubble. They used the ruins of buildings as cover. From shattered windows, bursts of automatic fire mowed down lines of German infantry. From dark, damp basements, where the air reeked of mold and decay, grenades were hurled at the tanks that roared through the uneven cobblestone streets. It was a war of shadows, where the invisible enemy attacked and disappeared, forcing the Germans to pay dearly for every meter gained. The buildings burned one after another in a chain of mutually feeding fires. The sound of screams, of the agonizing wounded, mothers calling for lost children, soldiers begging for mercy, mingled with the crackling of burning wooden beams and the roar of flames devouring antique furniture, hand-woven carpets, and religious icons. Civilians, some 200,000 inhabitants before the war, now reduced to starving shadows, dug precarious shelters in the basements of stone houses, piling up old boxes and mattresses to protect themselves from the vibrations of the explosions. Women in torn dresses and headscarves carried crying children in their arms, while elderly people, their backs bent with age, dragged buckets of water from contaminated wells to try to extinguish pockets of fire. But hell found them everywhere. Bombs pierced roofs, setting entire families ablaze. The hot July winds spread the flames across entire city blocks, consuming markets, schools, and makeshift hospitals where Soviet doctors, with trembling hands, amputated limbs without anesthesia. At night, the horizon was tinged with an infernal red, and the city illuminated the sky like a colossal bonfire, visible for dozens of kilometers. Crows and vultures flew over the ruins in black flocks, attracted by the stench of burnt flesh and decay, cawing like harbingers of death. The Germans, frustrated by the unexpected resistance, intensified their assault house by house. The panzers, with their rotating turrets and 75mm cannons spitting fire, pounded their tracks on the cracked pavement, crushing barricades and fallen bodies. Wehrmacht infantry, in Feldgrau uniforms soiled with sweat and dust, advanced behind the tanks, using hand grenades and flamethrowers to clear buildings. But each ruin concealed Soviet snipers. Exhausted men, starved for days without adequate rations, covered in soot that made them look like demons from the underworld. They fought with pure hatred, fueled by years of propaganda about the fascist threat, and many used the bodies of fallen comrades as shields, piling them in broken windows to absorb enemy bullets. German artillery, with pieces like 105mm howitzers and Nebelwerfer mortars that spewed howling rockets, bombarded incessantly day and night, creating craters that swallowed entire vehicles. The heat was unbearable, with temperatures rising beyond 30 degrees Celsius, exacerbated by fire that melted asphalt and metal. The air reeked of a nauseating mixture of gunpowder, charred flesh, burnt rubber from tires, and molten metal from exploding tanks. German armored vehicles moved through the flames, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters on the blackened walls. At every intersection, the ground trembled with explosions from improvised mines planted by the Soviets in holes dug during the night. Soviet counterattacks came in unpredictable waves. On July 23rd, an operational group under General Kachalov of the 28th Army launched an offensive from Roslavl, targeting the weakest point in the German perimeter, a gap between exhausted divisions. Soviet soldiers, some without adequate rifles, armed only with homemade grenades made from gasoline-filled bottles and burning rags, or even pieces of iron sharpened like improvised spears, threw themselves under the tracks of the tanks. They shouted, "Za Rodinu, za Stalina," for the motherland, for Stalin, while detonating explosives against the armored vehicles, sacrificing themselves in acts of heroic desperation. Other groups, such as those of the 19th Army under General Lukin, resisted in the encirclement pocket formed when German panzers joined east of Smolensk on July 27th, creating a cauldron where hundreds of thousands of Soviets were trapped. Even surrounded, even destroyed, Smolensk did not surrender. German generals like Guderian expected a swift collapse, but what they saw was an entire people forged by centuries of invasions and privations, determined to die where they were born. New Soviet reinforcements arrived by train or on foot, crossing dense forests and treacherous swamps to fill the gaps. The battle stretched for weeks, until September, with counter-offensives that cost rivers of blood. The Soviets lost entire divisions, with soldiers falling by the thousands, bodies piled into makeshift mass graves. The Germans, although victorious in the siege, suffered unexpected casualties, with supplies stretched and tanks breaking down from overuse on the poor roads. As night fell, the orange glow of the flames illuminated exhausted faces, and the silence was broken only by the occasional sniper shot or the groan of the wounded. The river water, now a thick sludge of blood, ash and oil, served as a desperate drink for the thirsty. And at the center of it all, among the ruins of ancient cathedrals, like the Assumption Cathedral, with their golden domes now melted and piles of corpses swollen by the heat, a red flag stubbornly fluttered, hoisted on a makeshift tower of rubble. It seemed to whisper to the invader, "You can burn everything, but you will never take Russia." Smolensk burned, consumed by a fire that would last for months, but in its blazing heart was born the resistance that would delay the German advance, exhausting their forces and planting the seeds for the harsh winter to come. The battle, though a tactical victory for the Germans, proved that the Soviet Union would not fall easily, forging a determination that would change the course of the war, echoing across the steppes to the gates of Moscow and beyond. August 1941. The summer winds, once laden with the scent of pine trees and ripe rye fields, now carried a suffocating veil of acrid smoke, burnt gunpowder, and the metallic odor of dried blood. The August heat, with temperatures soaring beyond 35 degrees Celsius on the open plains, transformed the air into a humid furnace, where sweat mingled with dust and soot, sticking tattered uniforms to irritated skin. Smolensk, the strategic jewel guarding the ancient route to Moscow, a city dating back to the 9th century as a Slavic stronghold against nomadic invaders, and which had withstood Polish sieges in the 17th century and Napoleonic hordes in 1812, now became a living tomb, a seething cauldron surrounded by an implacable ring of steel. The surrounding hills, covered in dense forests of birch and oak, served as elevated positions for the German observers, who spied on the pocket like medieval archers in siege towers. The German forces, exhausted after weeks of uninterrupted advance from the border in June, but still buoyed by the initial euphoria of Operation Barbarossa, closed the Iron Ring with surgical precision. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, coming from the south after crossing the Dnieper on makeshift floating bridges, joined Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group, which was descending from the north along the dusty roads of Vitebsk. On July 27th, the pincers closed east of the city at Yartsevo, creating an irregular pocket about 40 kilometers in diameter, an open-air prison where the Soviet 16th Army, under Lieutenant General Mikhail Lukin, the 19th, led by Lieutenant General Ivan Konev, and the 20th, under Lieutenant General Pavel Kurochkin, were irrevocably trapped. More than 300,000 men, a human mass of peasant recruits, factory workers, and officers who had survived the purges, found themselves trapped, their supplies cut off, their lines of retreat transformed into death corridors. From above, the Luftwaffe reigned supreme. Its Focke-Wulf FW-189 reconnaissance squadrons, nicknamed Flying Eyes for their twin wings, circled like hungry falcons, mapping every desperate move of the Soviets. German pilots, their aviator goggles fogged with sweat, transmitted precise coordinates to the Junkers Ju-88 bombers that dove in V formations, dropping loads that turned forest trails into smoking craters. Every main road, the old route to Moscow, paved with uneven cobblestone since Tsarist times, was under constant fire from anti-aircraft batteries converted for ground use, but the Soviet 76mm cannons, with their meager ammunition, barely scratched the plains. Secondary trails through swamps, where Soviet soldiers attempted to smuggle supplies in carts pulled by scrawny horses, were strafed by Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter planes, their propellers cutting through the air with a deadly hum. Bridges over the Dnieper and Kaspia rivers, once 19th-century iron structures, now lay twisted and broken, their melted beams hanging like broken bones. There was no escape. The siege was airtight, a slippery knot that tightened with each passing hour. The ground trembled incessantly under the roar of German artillery, a chorus of artificial thunder that made the soil vibrate like the skin of a giant drum. Artillery divisions such as the 17th and 18th, equipped with 150mm howitzers and the dreaded Nebelwerfer multiple rocket launchers, Stalin's organs in German irony because of their howl, fired coordinated salvos that covered entire areas in a rain of shrapnel. German tanks, Panzer IIIs with 50mm cannons, and the heavier Panzer IVs, covered in a crust of red dust and black soot, advanced in wedge formations, their tracks crushing the remains of Soviet barricades made of logs, abandoned furniture, and even burnt-out truck bodies. Behind them, the Wehrmacht infantry, in disciplined ranks but with faces marked by fatigue, used MG-34 machine guns mounted on tripods, whose characteristic sound, a rhythmic and merciless tack-tack-tack, reaped lives in seconds, transforming groups of Soviet soldiers into mounds of twisted bodies. The air was thick with dust raised by the explosions, gunpowder that irritated the eyes, and a haze of pulverized blood vapor. The very earth seemed to bleed, with red furrows where the wounded crawled, leaving viscous trails. The Soviets resisted with what remained of their forces, a fight that descended into the primal, where technology gave way to instinctive ferocity. Ammunition for Mosin Nagant rifles and PPSH-41 submachine guns had run out days before. Boxes of cartridges transported on exhausted mules were fought over with knives between platoons. Without bullets, soldiers bent rusty bayonets onto the ends of improvised sticks, or brandished pieces of iron torn from destroyed tanks, twisted rebar, crushed armor plates, trench shovels, common tools of sappers, became lethal weapons in hand-to-hand combat, crushing skulls with downward blows. It was a savage, primitive, desperate war. In the ruins of factories on the riverbanks, men grappled in pools of oil and blood, rolling across the ground covered with broken glass and loose bricks. Screams echoed like the throes of an ancient hell, howls of pain, curses mixed in Russian and German, the gurgling of severed throats. Every meter of ground was paid for with dozens of corpses, bodies piled into human barricades, where the living used the dead as shields, feeling the residual heat drain away as enemy bullets ricocheted off exposed bones. Communications, fragile from the start, were now completely destroyed. Field telephone lines, strung along trenches by teenage signalmen, had been severed by shrapnel or deliberately sabotaged by German patrols. Portable radios, heavy and prone to failure in the humidity, hissed with static, their batteries depleted after days of continuous use. Operators with makeshift leather headsets shouted codes that were lost in the ether. Messengers, young lieutenants or even civilian volunteers, tried to cross the perimeter on foot or on rusty bicycles, but fell under fire from German snipers positioned in the steeples of ruined churches. Soviet officers, with torn maps and cracked binoculars, shouted hoarse orders that the wind carried into nothingness, their voices lost in the roar of explosions. It was absolute chaos. Isolated platoons fought on their own, without knowing if the neighboring flank still existed, creating pockets of resistance that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. But even so, no one surrendered. The idea of capitulation was unthinkable, etched into their minds by years of indoctrination and the visceral fear of Stalinist reprisals against families left behind. General Mikhail Fyodorovich Lukin, a veteran of the Russian Civil War with saber scars on his face, commanded the surrounded forces of the 16th Army with stoic determination. Installed in a damp basement beneath the ruins of a school, lit by tall candles dripping wax onto stained maps, he refused to retreat or surrender. He knew the pocket was lost. Reports from captured prisoners confirmed German superiority in tanks and artillery, but his objective was not victory, but time. Time for Moscow, 400 kilometers to the east, to breathe and prepare. Factories evacuated to the Urals to mass-produce T-34 tanks, Siberian divisions hardened by the Manchurian cold to march to the front, anti-tank barricades to be erected in the streets of the capital. Lukin sent handwritten orders on scraps of paper passed through corridors. Hold every street, every hour counts. Smolensk was not just fighting for itself, it was the human shield of all Russia, a collective sacrifice that echoed the legendary defenses of cities like Sevastopol or Leningrad. Meanwhile, in German headquarters in camouflaged tents in the surrounding forests, Hitler's generals celebrated optimistic reports sent by teletype. Hundreds of thousands of Russians surrounded, Smolensk pocket liquidated soon, proclaimed messages to the Führer in Rastenburg. But victory was far from clean or cheap. The cost was monstrous. Panzer divisions designed for rapid advances of 50 kilometers a day now crawled at a human pace with overheated engines and tracks worn. Down by the uneven terrain, scarce supplies, fuel transported in Opel Blitz trucks that bogged down in the mud of night rains, rations reduced to stale bread and canned sausages, left German soldiers hungry and angry. Exhausted men, with deep, dark circles under their eyes and uniforms reeking of rancid sweat, began to question the invincibility of the Blitzkrieg. The advance, which should have been swift and overwhelming as in France, had turned into a quagmire of blood and smoke, where each captured village cost an entire company. Within the siege, despair had a human face, marked by hunger, wounds, and incipient madness. Starving soldiers, their bellies swollen with malnutrition, dragged themselves between craters filled with fetid water, chewing raw wheat grains, harvested from burnt fields or bitter nettle leaves that irritated their throats. Some, in acts of silent desperation, cut strips of leather from their boots or belts, boiling them in helmets filled with muddy water to extract a tasteless broth that barely sustained their bodies. Wounded, without morphine or clean bandages, they lay in makeshift mass graves. Gangrenous limbs swelled under the sun, attracting clouds of flies that laid eggs in open flesh. Field doctors, with rusty amputation saws, operated by lantern light while patients bit rags to muffle screams. Others, with exposed abdominal wounds, simply lay under the grey, smoke-laden sky, awaiting death and murmuring the names of distant wives or mothers. The nights were a living nightmare, where the veil of darkness amplified the horror. The fire from the persistent wildfires illuminated the horizon in an orange circle, transforming the landscape into a theater of dancing shadows. Wolves, hungry for the devastated forests, emerged from the woods in grey packs, their eyes reflecting the flames as they gnawed on the bones of dead horses or, in extreme cases, dragged human bodies into the darkness. The living, too exhausted to dig graves, slept beside the corpses, feeling rigor mortis stiffen cold limbs against their backs. Rats, fat and bold, scurried between the trenches as if they owned the field, gnawing indiscriminately on uniforms and flesh, their squeaks mingling with the groans of the dying. Bodies swelled under the daytime heat, exploding in clouds of fetid gases that made the air unbreathable, forcing survivors to cover their faces with makeshift masks of dirty gauze. Even so, the Soviets did not yield an inch without a fight. Every soldier, from the 18-year-old recruit to the 40-year-old veteran, knew that their sacrifice would be remembered in Moscow radio broadcasts, which bought with their own blood the precious time to erect new lines of defense. Trenches along the Desna River, minefields on the approaches to Vyazma. Breakthrough attempts occurred nightly. Assault groups, led by political commissars with Tokarev pistols, attacked weak points in the German ring under cover of darkness, using knives and grenades to create temporary breaches. Many died, but some escaped, carrying wounded on their backs through swamps where the water reached their waists. The siege closed inexorably, the pocket shrinking to mere square kilometers by mid-August, when the last organized resistance was crushed. But in the silence between the bombardments, those rare moments when the roar ceased and only the crackling of flames remained, what could be heard were hoarse and stubborn voices echoing from basements and craters. They can kill us all, but Moscow will not fall. Mother Russia will live. It was a whispered oath, passed from soldier to soldier like a torch in the darkness, a thread of hope linking the hell of Smolensk to the distant salvation of the capital. The sacrifice, though swallowed by the ring of steel, planted the seeds of a counter-offensive that months later would echo in the winter snows, proving that the siege, however tight, could not stifle the spirit of a people willing to do anything for survival. The siege of Smolensk seemed to be sealed. The German generals believed the enemy was finished, that all they had to do was clench their fists and crush the remains. But what Hitler and his men didn't know was that behind the chaos, a new general was rising from the ashes, Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov, cold, calculating and ruthless, had been hastily summoned to reorganize the Soviet defenses. He looked at the blood-stained maps and understood something that few saw. Smolensk was not the end. It was the turning point. If they could hold off the Germans there, the race to Moscow could be interrupted. It was a suicidal gamble, but he made it anyway. Zhukov's orders were short and brutal. Attack at any cost. And the impossible began to happen. During the night, columns of T-34 tanks emerged from the forests like metallic shadows. The sound of their engines mingled with the distant thunder of the artillery. The Germans, exhausted and overconfident, did not expect a counterattack and were caught off guard. Suddenly, the battlefield of Smolensk was transformed into a hell of steel and fire. Soviet cannons opened fire from the hills. The German positions burst into flames, and columns of black smoke rose to the sky. The German trenches, once safe, were now being swept by grenades, mortars, and incessant bursts of gunfire. The T-34s, almost indestructible against German medium guns, advanced like monsters. Its tracks crushed bodies, wreckage, and craters, clearing a path through the damaged tanks. The Germans tried to fight back, but every shot seemed futile. The Soviet tanks simply kept coming. Amid the smoke and shouting, Russian soldiers emerged from all sides. Some were unarmed, wielding knives, shovels, and even improvised Molotov cocktails made with gasoline and vodka. Hatred burned in his eyes. They attacked, as if the earth itself had spat them back out to fight. The Germans retreated, shocked. What seemed like a defeated enemy had transformed into a vengeful horde. Each Soviet shot was a roar of fury, each explosion a vow of revenge for the dead of Minsk, Kiev, and the burned villages. Zhukov coordinated the attack with surgical precision. He moved entire divisions like chess pieces, cutting off supply routes, isolating columns, and encircling enemy flanks. What was once a glorious breakthrough was becoming a deadly labyrinth. The roads were clogged with wrecked trucks, dead horses, and burned-out tanks. The air smelled of iron, oil, and charred flesh. On German radios, voices trembled. They're everywhere. You can't tell where the attack begins and ends. It was total chaos. The pride of the Wehrmacht, which believed itself to be invincible, now stumbled in mud, fire, and fear. The soldiers were shouting for ammunition, for help, but the orders came in a confused, desperate tone. The German command was beginning to realize the unthinkable. The Nazi war machine could bleed, and Zhukov knew this. With each passing hour, he watched the enemy weaken. His plan wasn't to win at Smolensk. It was to drag the Germans into the abyss, to make them waste fuel, men, and time. Time, the most precious commodity Moscow needed to erect its defenses. When the sun set over the countryside, Smolensk was a blazing inferno. Bodies burned amidst melting tanks, and the sound of machine guns mingled with the cries of the wounded. But, in the midst of that apocalyptic vision, a truth emerged from the flames. The Wehrmacht was still advancing, but it was no longer the same. Hitler's dream was beginning to rot. At the height of the Battle of Smolensk, while the ground still boiled with blood and metal, the voices of reason began to shout in Berlin. Experienced generals, men like Guderian and Bock, pleaded with Hitler, "Mein Führer, we need to stop. The army is exhausted, the enemy is not defeated." But Hitler wouldn't listen. Trapped in his own delusions of grandeur, he believed that the fate of the war was already sealed. To him, Russia was a house of cards about to collapse, and any retreat, any hesitation would be a sign of weakness, something the dictator would never admit. With his gaze fixed on the map, Hitler drew lines with his red pencil, completely ignoring the reality of the front. He ordered the German forces to be divided, with one part heading towards Leningrad, another towards Kiev, and the remainder continuing towards Moscow. A catastrophic decision. The generals were shocked. That meant spreading the army's power in 3 directions, just when Soviet resistance was growing. But no one dared disobey. Fear of the Führer outweighed military logic. As German tanks crawled along roads covered in debris, logistical chaos escalated. Trucks stuck in the mud, tracks destroyed, planes out of fuel. What should have been a glorious march forward became a struggle against time, the weather, and their own pride. The soldiers, once confident, now murmured silently. His torn boots sank into mud mixed with blood. The animal feed had run out. They ate whatever they found, dead horses, raw potatoes, even soup made with melted snow, and the casualties were uncontrollable. Hundreds of thousands of Germans lay dead on the roads of Belarus and Western Russia. The field hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors were amputating limbs without anesthesia, using rusty saws. Ocero di gangrena impregnava uar. Nazi glory was rotting under the Russian summer sun. But Hitler remained, impassive, locked in his headquarters, shouting at the maps, "There are no obstacles. Moscow will fall in September." Meanwhile, the German High Command knew that something terrible was happening. The Russians were not fleeing. They were retreating in formation, reorganizing their forces, preparing ambushes. For every kilometer gained, the German army lost time, fuel, and men. With each village burned down, more peasants joined the resistance. The reports would arrive and be ignored. The Soviets are bringing about new divisions in the east. We are facing unknown tanks, armor that is impossible to penetrate. But Hitler laughed. Lies! Russia is broken. I know what I'm doing. Time passed. The offensive which was supposed to last weeks, had already been dragging on for months, and the advance towards Moscow, once so rapid, was now a snail's pace for a hungry and exhausted army. Zhukov, on the other side, observed everything. He saw the enemy losing its way, dividing itself, and wearing itself down. Smolensk had fulfilled its role. There, in the burned ruins of that city, Hitler's plan began to crumble. The Führer believed he was at the height of his power, but in reality, he had just paved the way for his first major catastrophe. The Colossus with feet of clay, as he called the Red Army, was still standing, and now it was learning how to fight. The German advance continued, slow, bloody, and increasingly costly, but now something new was emerging from the bowels of Russia. The Soviets, led by Zhukov and other commanders who learned from initial mistakes, began to erect an invisible wall, defense in depth. This new tactic was brutal and simple. Don't try to stop the enemy at a single point, but rather kill them slowly. Every village, every river, every forest was transformed into a trap. Nothing would be gained for free anymore. When the German avant-garde advanced, they were met with silence. The villages seemed empty until the first soldiers entered them, and then all hell broke loose. Snipers hiding in barns, machine guns camouflaged under piles of hay, mines buried under the roads. The advance became an endless sequence of explosions and ambushes. The dense, humid Russian forests swallowed entire columns of vehicles. The partisans, Soviet guerrillas armed with grenades and courage, attacked at night, killed and disappeared into the darkness. German trains derailed, warehouses caught fire, radios were sabotaged. The Red Army was no longer fighting only with rifles, it was fighting with the land itself. And at the heart of this resistance, a new faith was emerging. The Soviet soldiers, who months before had fled in panic, were now shouting, "For Smolensk, for Moscow, for Mother Russia!" They knew the enemy was losing strength. The Germans were too far from home, out of supplies, facing an enemy that seemed to multiply the more it was beaten. In the German ranks, morale was plummeting. Intelligence reports were beginning to reveal a terrible truth. Soviet factories previously under threat were being moved beyond the Urals, out of range of bombers. Instead of breaking the power of the Soviet Union, Hitler had forced the country to transform itself into an indestructible fortress. Meanwhile, the German generals began to realize the nightmare. Every kilometer gained was a cemetery. The terrain was covered in mines, craters, and corpses. The panzer tanks, lacking spare parts, broke down and were abandoned. The infantry units had been reduced to half their original strength. The Soviets were retreating, but they were retreating, fighting, burning everything. Farms, bridges, railroads, nothing was left to the enemy. The scorched earth policy turned the German advance into an agonizing exercise. There was no food, no shelter, no rest. The nights were cold, and the distant sound of wolves mingled with the cries of the wounded. One night, a German captain wrote in his diary, "We are not facing men, but ghosts. Russia does not surrender. Russia does not die." While the German army sank into mud and despair, Soviet morale soared like wildfire. Smolensk had taught the lesson. The enemy could bleed. And now, with each passing day, with each passing kilometer, the Red Army learned to kill with greater precision, with greater fury, with greater coldness. Zhukov watched the front lines and murmured a phrase that would forever echo in history. "Let them go on. When they stop, it will be the end of them." The Soviet counterattack was not merely a tactic, it was the beginning of a complete change of destiny. The Nazi Empire, which believed itself invincible, was beginning to slowly dissolve. In the Russian swamp, in the snow, in the blood, and in the pride. Smolensk, the city that Hitler believed to be just another conquest on the map, had become a black hole, sucking the lives, fuel, and hope out of the German army. What began as a lightning offensive was now a prolonged nightmare, a field of bones and smoke, where victory cost more than defeat. The roads were covered in debris, burned-out tanks, dead horses, overturned trucks. The Russian summer heat rotted everything, and the air was heavy with the smell of corpses and burnt oil. The soldiers slept in the craters, waking to the sound of Soviet mortars that never stopped. With each sunrise, more comrades were missing, swallowed up by artillery fire or night attacks. Hitler, in Berlin, still believed that Smolensk was a triumph. Radios broadcast victory bulletins showing columns of Soviet prisoners and swastika flags waving in the ruins. But the generals knew the truth. Smolensk was not a victory. It was a trap. As the Wehrmacht advanced, the Soviets closed the invisible encirclement. Each time the Germans captured a city, they moved further away from their supply lines. Ammunition trains were attacked by partisans, trains derailed, and depots set on fire. The Germans were gaining territory, but losing time. And in Russia, time was the deadliest enemy. The advance to Moscow, which should have been swift, stalled due to exhaustion. The engines were failing, the radios were breaking down, the soldiers were getting sick. Hunger was constant. The cold was beginning to set in, and the men's faces showed the weight of despair. Those who had marched in glory now walked like ghosts, the brilliance of triumph replaced by the empty gaze of weariness. The Soviets, on the other hand, were experiencing a rebirth. Every day, new soldiers, new tanks, and new weapons rolled out of the factories in the east. It was as if the country itself was spitting out steel and vengeance. And Zhukov, observing the map, saw that the plan was working. The enemy was being swallowed up, easy prey for the vastness and obstinacy of Russia. The German generals began to realize, too late, Smolensk had drained the best of the Wehrmacht. Lost tanks, destroyed divisions, dead officers. The elite units were now exhausted, unable to continue the offensive with the same force. Hitler, however, refused to accept. Moscow is the heart of the beast. I will take it even if I have to drag every German soldier there. But the beast's heart had already changed. The Soviet army was now a different one. Hardened, vengeful, disciplined. Smolensk had been the melting pot that forged the new soul of Russia. And while the flames consumed the city's ruins, a new sound echoed from the front. Not the victory song of the Wehrmacht, but the growing murmur of a force reborn from its own suffering. Soviet soldiers covered in soot marched back to the lines, shouting amidst the wreckage, "They've come all the way here, but they will never get past Smolensk." The Smolensk trap was not just a tactical defeat for Hitler. It was the first crack in the myth of German invincibility, the beginning of the end of the dream of conquering the East. There, on the banks of the Dnieper, the Blitzkrieg was dying down, and the nightmare of the soon-to-come Russian winter was being born. The colossus with feet of clay, as Hitler mocked him, had just risen. When the fires finally ceased over Smolensk, the silence brought not peace, it brought horror. The city, once vibrant, was now unrecognizable. A jumble of ruins, craters, and corpses. The streets, covered in ash, looked like dried-up rivers of coagulated blood. The air was heavy, dense, and smelled of death, an odor that seeped into the skin, impossible to forget. The Germans walked silently among the rubble, lacking their former arrogance. Their uniforms were torn, dirty, stained with mud and the blood of their comrades. The gleam of the medals could no longer hide the empty gaze of someone who had seen hell. Smolensk was not a trophy, it was a graveyard. Among the ruins, thousands of bodies lay piled up. German and Soviet soldiers mixed together, enemies in death as they had been in life. Some still had their hands outstretched, as if trying to grasp air before their last breath. Others had embraced each other, petrified by the explosion, transformed into grotesque statues of dust and pain. The wounded cried out for help, but there were not enough doctors, nor medicine, nor mercy. The field hospitals were overflowing. Amputee men shouted their mothers' names. Many begged to be killed, to escape the agony. Each night, dozens were carried to the mass graves, some alive, others not. Soviet prisoners captured during the siege were marched westward in endless columns. No food, no water under the scorching sun. Those who fell along the way were killed with a shot to the back of the neck. The Germans called this order. The Soviets called it a massacre. The fields surrounding the city have become mass graves. Orphaned children wandered through the ruins, scavenging for anything that could be eaten. Women wept in front of destroyed houses, searching for husbands and children among the rubble. The birds had flown away. Even they couldn't stand the smell of death. And yet, in the midst of that nightmare, the resistance did not die. In the shadows of the nearby forests, small groups of surviving Soviet soldiers gathered. No uniform, no flag, but with a single mission: to avenge Smolensk. At night, they attacked German trains, cut telephone lines, and killed sentries. The city might be lost, but the Russian spirit is not. Smolensk was now a symbol, a cry of fury and survival. The German generals were trying to cover up the disaster. Cold reports, figures, colorful maps, but none of this could hide the truth that hung over the front. Smolensk had cost too much. So costly that victory was no longer worth the price paid in blood. And even among the Wehrmacht officers themselves, a shadow was beginning to grow. They whispered to each other on silent nights, "If this is what happened in Smolensk, what will happen when we get to Moscow?" The answer would come months later, frozen in the snow and written with the same blood spilled there. But at that moment, gazing at the smoke-covered horizon, the few survivors already knew Smolensk was not just the end of a battle. It was the curse that would follow the German army until the end of the war. Smolensk, a name that, for the Germans, would soon become synonymous with despair. It was July 1941, and the sweltering heat of the Russian summer made the air vibrate like fire on the ground. The dirt roads were teeming with endless columns of tanks, trucks, horses, and men, all exhausted, covered in dust, hungry, and with frayed nerves. Hitler believed Smolensk would be just another stop on the way to Moscow, an obstacle that would fall in days. But there, in the heart of Russia, the dream of Blitzkrieg began to unravel. The Red Army, far from being defeated, retreated in order to the defenses of Smolensk. Marshal Timoshenko prepared a trap, one that the Germans did not realize until it was too late. When Guderian and Hoth's divisions advanced confidently to encircle the city, Soviet forces, instead of fleeing, stood their ground and counterattacked with savage fury. T-34 tanks emerged from the forests, almost invulnerable to enemy fire. Soviet machine guns roared from the ruins, and on the banks of the Dnieper, German soldiers discovered hell. Soviet paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, sabotaging supplies, cutting communications, spreading chaos. Every street in Smolensk became a fortress, every house a machine gun nest. The fighting was hand-to-hand with bayonets, grenades, and the desperation of those who knew there was no way out. Guderian later wrote that he had never seen such resistance. The Soviets fought like cornered animals. But it wasn't savagery, it was determination. Every soldier in the Red Army knew that if Smolensk fell, Moscow would be next. And so, under relentless fire, Soviet troops transformed the city into a living trap, a trap that began to devour the pride of the Third Reich, man by man, tank by tank. The Germans still believed they were winning, but Smolensk was already swallowing them up. The siege began as a victory and ended as a nightmare. At the end of July 1941, German troops managed to encircle dozens of Soviet divisions around Smolensk. Hitler believed this was the decisive blow. "The Red Army is finished," he said confidently. But what the German generals didn't know was that within that encirclement lay something they had never faced before, an enemy that refused to die. Inside the German steel ring, more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers were isolated, without food, without ammunition, without reinforcements. Moscow's orders were clear: resist to the last man. And they resisted. The days turned into weeks of brutal combat. The streets and fields around the city became cemeteries of twisted metal. Corpses, swollen by the summer heat, were piled up beside the roads. The air smelled of blood and gasoline. The Luftwaffe bombed relentlessly, and the roar of the Stukas made the ground tremble. But for every group of Soviets that was destroyed, another emerged from the ruins, ready to fight. The Germans, accustomed to Blitzkrieg, now moved at a slow pace, meter by meter, house by house. Every advance costs blood. At night, the fighting didn't stop. The sky over Smolensk burned like hell. Orange flames danced over the ruins, and the shadows of the men looked like demons waging an endless war. The voices on German radio began to change. The optimistic reports gave way to weariness, doubt, and fear. Many soldiers began writing in letters home, "Something is wrong here. They don't give up. They never stop." And indeed, the Soviets did not stop. Even surrounded, they began to break through the German lines in small groups, like snakes escaping through cracks. They attacked convoys, ambushed patrols, and sabotaged bridges. The siege, which was supposed to be a symbol of German superiority, became an open wound on the Eastern Front. Smolensk was destroyed, but alive in a way the Germans could never have imagined. The colossus with feet of clay that Hitler had despised was rising from the ashes, and now it bled, but it did not fall. In July 1941, the Germans believed they had surrounded and destroyed 3 Soviet armies near Smolensk. For Hitler, this was proof that the USSR was about to collapse. But this vision was an illusion. While the Wehrmacht celebrated, the Soviets, led by Timoshenko and Zhukov, desperately reorganized. They used everything they had: damaged tanks, armed civilians, makeshift militias. Villages became fortresses, roads turned into trenches, and surprise attacks from the forests began to wear down the Germans day by day. The German advance, once rapid, began to slow. Hitler demanded an urgent approach to Moscow, but his generals knew they were becoming trapped, exhausted, and vulnerable. The Soviets were not trying to win. They were trying to buy time to mobilize the entire country for war. In the end, Smolensk revealed Hitler's fatal mistake, believing he had already won. The trap wasn't Soviet. It was created by German pride itself. Smolensk became the silent warning of what was to come in Moscow, Stalingrad, and finally Berlin.